I call it Martha Brooks and the Apples. Martha Brooks, Goody Brooks as she was known in Salem town and village, she had but little. A little house, a little land, a little apple orchard. Very little. It was just Martha. She'd inherited it all from her grandmother, who had raised her after her parents had died. It was just the two of them, working together, nurturing the apples in the apple orchard and making the apple jelly and the apple pies and the apple butter and trading them in the village or selling them for the necessities that they couldn't provide for themselves. Finally, her grandmother died, and Martha wrote her death date in the little space next to her name and the big book that she kept for family records, and then Martha carried on alone. It was not an easy life, but it was not without its rewards. Oh, Martha was well known around Salem for her industrious nature and for her apples. Though she had a small orchard, it always produced abundantly, and people came for the apples and for what she made with the apples. The apple butter, the apple jelly, the apple cider, the apple pies that tasted like heaven, and more. Sometimes young women would come for charms to meet and attract a special young man. And then Martha would show them how to pare an apple in one long spiral peeling, which when tossed over the left shoulder would invariably form the first initial of their own true love. And if they wanted further proof, they could cut into the apple and count the apple pips while they recited, 1 I love, 2 I love, 3 I love, I say, 4 I love with all my heart, 5 I cast away, 6 he loves, 7 she loves, 8 they both love, 9 he comes, 10 he tarries, 11 he courts, and 12 he marries. Well, it was all good fun, but it did seem to work often enough. Sometimes people would come to Martha for a forked apple stick that they felt like made a wonderful dowsing rod so they could tell where to dig for wells. And often people came for potions for healing, for Martha was known as a cunning woman, and she seemed to know everything that apples could do. She knew that an apple syrup could calm a cough. She knew that an apple tea could soothe a sore throat. Applesauce was good for stomach troubles, and a poultice of mashed apple mixed with herbs when bound to a wound would hasten healing. And if all of it was delivered with an ancient verse, well, so much the better. But it was not just the apples that people valued. Martha's land, it was not a large piece of land, and in her grandmother's day, it had been well outside the limits of the village. But now, with the growth in the area, it was inside the boundaries of that town and considered very desirable. And no one desired it more than John Porter. John Porter was a man of considerable wealth and influence, and he had land, but not much. It had been divided several times through generations of Porters, and John had six sons who were soon growing into manhood and would want land and homes and families of their own. John Porter looked around, and he figured that Martha Brooks's land would be just perfect. He would cut down the trees, use the lumber for houses. Perfect. In fact, it was so perfect that sometimes he forgot one small detail, and that was that the land did not belong to him. That didn't discourage him, however, though. One day in harvest time, he came to Martha Brooks's house with an offer to buy her land. "It's a good offer, Goody Brooks," he said. "The money will keep you for the rest of your life." That's what he said, but what he was thinking was, the land is meant to be mine. Once you sell it to me, well, then I can begin to clear it. Martha Brooks said, "My land is not for sale, not to you or to anyone else." That's what she said. But what she thought was, "And if I were to ever sell it, John Porter, it would not be to you. I know that you are a greedy and ruthless man. You will cut down my apple trees, and that will be nothing short of murder. I will not have it." "Well, think it over, Goody Brooks," he said. "I'll be back." That's what he said. But what he thought was, "You'd best agree, or you'll be sorry." Well, he did come back several times in the ensuing months, always with an offer which was always refused. John Porter had thought to himself, "I am a patient man, and you are an old woman. I can wait." But as the months passed, he became less and less patient. And so the following year in harvest, he came back to visit Martha Brooks with a new offer. He said, "Take it, Martha, take it. You know it's the right thing to do." That's what he said. But what he thought was, "You'd best take it, Martha. I have a plan." She said, "No, I said no. And I meant no. Get off my land, John Porter, and don't come back." That's what she said. But what she thought was, "He sounds dangerous. I need a plan." Well, that day, John Porter went back home and he gathered his sons and he told them his plan. He said, I'm going to go back tomorrow morning, first thing, and I'll give her another offer, which I expect fully that foolish old woman will reject. I should be there and gone by midday. Do you go around midday after I am gone, and bring your wagon and bring your saws and axes and cut down one of her apple trees. Choose one that's close to the cottage. I wish her to see it being cut down and hear it being cut down. Oh, she will object, of course, but what can one small old woman do against 6 strong men? She will see when that apple tree falls that she is no match for us, and she will yield." The boys grinned. It was a good plan. But that night after supper, Martha Brooks figured out her own plan. She got down that heavy volume, the one where all the important records had been kept. There in the front were all the names and birth and marriage and death dates. There was her grandmother's, the death date written in Martha's own handwriting. All of her ancestors, all the way back to Dorset in England. Martha saw her own name with a space next to it for her friends to fill in her death date, as she had no family. She flipped through the book until she came to the recipes for apple butter, apple cider, apple pie. Oh, the delicious treats that had made her famous around town. Further, to the charms and incantations for young women looking for true love, and the potions and poultices for healing. Further, she found Bible verses, her favorites, that she'd written down so she would remember them, and notes on some of the sermons that she'd heard, all the way to the back of the book where there were other instructions, other verses, darker, stronger, more powerful. Her grandmother had always said that they were never to be used except in times of danger or desperation. And to Martha Brooks, it seemed like this was one of those times. So she studied all of that until late in the night. Well, the next morning, John Porter came. He came with an offer. He said, "Accept my offer, Martha Brooks, or you will regret it." And she said, "Get off my land, John Porter, or you will regret it." Now, when he had come to the door, she answered the door with a stick. He took it for a stirring stick. He thought that perhaps he had interrupted her making applesauce. But when she told him to get out, well, it struck him wrong, and he raised his hand as if to hit her. But she raised hers, the one with a stick in it, which he saw now was not a stirring implement, but rather a short apple branch. And she took that apple wand, and in a voice that was clear and strong, she said, pointing that apple wand straight at him, "Apple blossom, apple wood, make this charm strong and good. He who would destroy my trees, change him now to one of these." Well, John Porter turned to go, or rather he would have turned to go if he could have. He felt himself quite literally rooted to the spot. He felt his feet burrow into the earth. His toes turned to roots and took hold. The arm that he had raised, he saw the fingers lengthen and sprout leaves. He looked at his arm. The skin on his arm became rough and dark like bark. He cried out for help, but the voice was not the voice of a man, but the moaning and groaning as of two tree branches rubbing together, though it was a calm day. After a while, only his eyes worked properly, and what they saw terrified him. When finally the transformation was complete, Martha Brooks turned and walked back into her cottage and shut the door. Well, shortly after that, the Porter boys arrived with their wagon and their axes and saws. They looked around. There was the obvious tree. Their father had said, choose one near the cottage, and this one was just outside the door. They wondered about that. They thought, who would plant a tree so close to the cottage? Or who would build a cottage so close to a tree? Well, it didn't matter. It suited their purposes fine. And so the oldest boy got out his axe and began to cut. But from the very start, they could see that it was not going to be as easy as they had anticipated. At the first blow, the axe handle split in two, and the axe head flew off and into the bushes. Luckily, they'd brought another one, but that one had trouble too. The tree almost seemed to resist being cut down. It twisted and turned, though there was no wind. Finally, they got out the big, long, double-handled saw, and taking turns, the 6 boys, 2 at a time, they sawed until the tree fell with a horrible moan. Then they tied it to their wagon and they dragged it off to the mill, where they told the miller to cut it into planks. They weren't going to use it to build their houses, but they told him to save the bits and pieces to use for walking sticks or for furniture or for handles for tools. The miller agreed, and then they went home to tell their father. But he was not there. They were surprised. They were excited to tell him how successful they'd been. But he wasn't there that night. And the next morning, he still had not showed up. And when the 3rd day came and John Porter was nowhere to be found, his sons thought, well, at least they could go to the mill and get their lumber. And so they did. And the mill keeper, he met them and he said, I don't know where you got that tree, but if I were you, I would burn it. He said, it has caused me nothing but trouble. Twice, the branches leapt from the traces in my mill, injuring 2 of my best workers. It dulled my saw blades, and all the while it gave such a horrible, pitiful shriek that my workers were completely unnerved. I think it's bewitched. You should burn it. Well, the boys listened, but they paid him no heed, and they took the lumber back to their house. Their father was still not there. So that night after supper, they thought, well, perhaps they could at least begin on a few small projects. And Israel started to shape some spindles that he was going to use for a staircase railing. But in the shaping, the spindles warped and twisted, and so they were completely unusable. Benjamin decided to make a simple side table, but though he measured and cut and measured and cut and measured and cut, it would never sit flat. Samuel decided to make a small, simple wooden bowl, but in the carving of it, his knife slipped and he cut a gash in his thumb. And the trouble didn't stop after they went upstairs to bed. They were awakened in the night by crashing. And in the morning, when they came downstairs, there were bits and pieces of wood all over the place, and 6 of their crockery plates smashed to bits. Well, now completely unnerved, those Porter boys, they gathered up all the wood that they could, and they took it out to a field and burned it, as the miller had suggested. But even the fire was not like anything they could have imagined. They thought cutting down the tree was difficult. Well, in the cutting, they remembered that the sap did not run clear, but it was thick and dark and red. And when they lit the wood on fire, it began to spark and spit flames, and it shrieked and moaned and seemed almost alive. But finally, it all collapsed in a heap of ash. The next morning, those Porter boys, they packed up everything they could, and they moved away. They never came back to Salem again. But as for Martha, well, she lived another 15 years, a good 15 years, with all of her friends. She kept on with everything she always did. Every year when she made apple cider, she wassailed the trees. She poured some of the cider on the roots of the trees. And every year when the harvest was over, she left the last apple, the apple man, she called it, hanging on the tree to ensure a bountiful harvest the next year. And she treated her trees like children. She sang to them. She talked to them. They were friends. But finally, Martha Brooks did die. And her friends wrote her death date in the large book where she'd left a space for it. And they buried her according to her request, not in the churchyard, but in the orchard, right in the middle of a circle of her favorite apple trees. And the next harvest time, her friends were the ones that made the cider and wassailed the trees as she had asked. And they made sure to wassail Martha's grave as well. In time, a tree grew up out of the grave. It was an apple tree, of course, but of a variety that no one had ever seen before. But quickly it became a favorite around that area. The trees never grew very big, but they were strong, and they produced abundantly. Wonderful apples, a beautiful color, sweet and mellow, but firm, and with just a little bit of a bite. And that is the story of Martha Brooks and her apples. Thank you.